Good morning, sir. We pick up the picture today with Winchester, about which there is, I'm afraid, little by way of contemporaneous documentation. The Winchester Centre, Centre number 11, was based at the Royal Hampshire County Hospital and was designated a centre, it would seem, in late 1976. And the director from that point on through into the 1980s was Dr. Mather. Unfortunately, we only have one annual return from the relevant period. That's at HCDO 0001681. You'll see it's the annual return for 1982. It identifies Dr. Mather as the director. It doesn't give the number of patients treated during the year, but there are over the page, we don't need to go over the page, but there are over the page details which would suggest probably 5 patients being treated. And then we can see that the therapeutic materials in use during 1982 comprised cryoprecipitate and NHS concentrates, a little more cryoprecipitate than concentrate, but only a little. So that, I'm afraid, is the limit of the information that we have from annual returns for Winchester. If we go to CBLA 0002213, we can see that as at July 1985, the Wessex Regional Transfusion Centre, and I should have said Winchester fell within.
My screen is not working. Neither of my screens are. So that needs to be sorted. This is now working here. Well, once Schumach's back in his usual seat, we can begin again. I'm sorry about that.
So this is looking at a letter, July 1985. It's from Dr. Smith, who was the director of the Wessex Regional Transfusion Centre in Southampton, and that was the transfusion centre which supplied the Haemophilia Centre in Winchester. It's to Mr. Pettit at BPL, and it's concerning the submission of names to receive heat-treated products from BPL. We can see from the second paragraph, it refers to Dr. Mather sending the names of the following patients who are on regular factor VIII treatment for haemophilia. So it would appear that as at July 1985, 3 patients in Winchester receiving regular factor VIII treatment and hence being put forward for the receipt of heat-treated BPL concentrate at that point in time. If we go next to DHSC 302247_090, you will see, and we looked at this letter yesterday in relation to some of the other centres, the Winchester Centre was also in receipt of the notification from Wessex Regional Transfusion Centre following the discovery that a donor had been diagnosed with AIDS. And if we then go on to CBLA 5010_211, we can see here a follow-up letter, 8th of October 1984, from the Wessex Regional Transfusion Centre to Dr. Snape at BPL, relating to the contaminated batch HL3186, and it refers to the number of vials sent to haemophilia centres in Wessex and the numbers returned. We can see in relation to Winchester, it identifies 10 vials of this batch having been sent to Winchester and none having been returned. We don't need to go to the document. I'll just give the reference for the transcript. But DHSC 0004180_050, which we looked at yesterday in relation to Salisbury, identified that one patient at Winchester had been transfused with this particular batch of BPL product. If we go next to CBLA 5010_188, we'll see that Dr. Mayville at Winchester is identified as the third recipient of this letter. So he was also sent the letter from Dr. Krask identifying what investigations should be carried out and raising those issues we looked at yesterday in terms of the question of whether to tell the patient or not about the risk. If we then go to INQY 40250, we go to the second page. Line 11, or centre 11, is Winchester. You'll see this is based upon the data provided to the inquiry by UKHCDO, and it suggests one patient testing positive for HIV in 1985. Again, whether that correlates with the patient who was transfused with the BPL batch or not is not something that we've been able to establish. I should say, in terms of information about HIV infection at Winchester, that there are two further documents, OXUH 0002207. If we look at the very top of the page, we'll see it says AIDS cases reported on AIDS/3 forms received by the 8th of October 1990. And the AIDS 3 forms, you'll recall, is one of the forms circulated by Dr. Krask back in 1983. So it appears this is part of the Public Health Laboratory Service, or CDSC, AIDS surveillance programme. And if we turn to page 9, if we look 4 entries up from the bottom, the fourth entry up, and the column that is the fourth column along from the left is the centre number. So 011 indicates centre 11, Winchester, and it indicates a case of AIDS being submitted to CDSC in July 1988. But if we read along, it then refers to what was said to be the first positive test being in July of 1985, which would correlate with the information that we received from UKHCDO. It also then further indicates that patient died in 1990. We can take that down, thank you, Shomik. The information on that form suggests that it may have been a child, I should say. But again, we have comparatively little information from Winchester, so I can't confirm that definitively. There is also, if we look at HCDO 40119_097, a letter from Ms. Spooner to Dr. Maver in November of 1990, which refers to a new case of HIV transmission at the centre. What that is a reference to, whether it's a case being picked up late, or whether the same case being reported late, or indeed someone who had transferred to Winchester from another centre, I'm afraid we can't tell. That's all we have. We don't have any contemporaneous documentation to cast any light on the question of Dr. Maver's knowledge of risks of viral infection, I'm afraid. And he does not appear to have been an attender at UKHCDO meetings. However, he was an identified director from the 1970s, and there's no reason to think he wouldn't have been sent the minutes or the communications in 1983 from Drs. Krask, Bloom and Ritzer. In relation to hepatitis, there are a handful of documents that show the hospital in the 70s reporting cases of post-transfusion hepatitis. And then there's one document only in relation to hepatitis that I'll pick up on specific to haemophilia, and that's TREL 40/180_004. This is a letter not, in fact, addressed to Dr. Maver, but to Dr. Greaves at the Royal Hampshire County Hospital in Winchester, February 1978. It's in relation to a particular patient, and it's from Dr. Painter at Trelaws. We don't, I think, need to look at the details in relation to the particular patient, but if we look at the bottom of the page, the heading Prognosis, we can see some observations about hepatitis and blood products being communicated to Dr. Greaves at Hampshire Hospital. Picking it up in the third line, he is at risk from developing hepatitis secondary to repeated treatment with blood products. At this moment, it is not possible to say precisely what the chances of this are, but it is not too great when the alternative of not treating the bleeds is considered. So that's the view being expressed to the hospital in Winchester. What the view was of those treating patients in Winchester in relation to risk of hepatitis and cost-benefit analysis, we don't know.
I don't understand that sentence. Perhaps you may be able to suggest a better interpretation to me, but what are the alternatives of not treating the bleeds got to do with the chances of developing hepatitis?
Nothing at all, logically, sir.
So it just doesn't make any sense?
No. The alternative of not treating bleeds might be relevant, obviously, to the balancing exercise, balance of risks. But you're absolutely right, sir. It doesn't have any logical connection whatsoever with the chances of developing hepatitis. So it's poorly expressed.
Probably what he's trying to say, I would think, is we might choose not to give him the product because he might get hepatitis, but we will give him the product because the chances of him having a serious bleed are worse.
Yes. I suspect that is what Dr. Painter meant.
But as expressed, it just doesn't follow.
And I draw it to your attention really because it's one of the few documents relating to Winchester, I'm afraid, that we've been able to unearth. So I'm afraid that's the picture in relation to Winchester, a small centre and one about which we have comparatively little information. The tour of the UK is going to move now to East Anglia and to Cambridge. The Cambridge Haemophilia Centre was based at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. The director of the centre in the 1970s until 1984 was Dr. Chalmers, and then Dr. Seaman took over and was director from 1984 to 1990. We have a statement from her at, we don't need to put it up, Shimik, but it's at WITN 3815002. When Dr. Seaman retired, Dr. Trevor Baglin took over, and then in due course in 2004, Dr. David Perry became co-director of the centre. We do have a statement from Dr. Perry as well. Again, I'll just read the reference for the benefit of the transcript. WITN 3173004. The Cambridge Haemophilia Centre was the largest haemophilia centre in the East Anglian region, and it received its supplies of cryoprecipitate and concentrate through the Cambridge Regional Transfusion Centre. There's some correspondence in the 1970s between the Cambridge Regional Transfusion Centre and Dr. Maycock at BPL, which casts some light on the position in relation to supplies and shortfalls. We can pick it up at DHSC 0002359_043. So this is a letter from Dr. Darnborough, who was the director of the Regional Transfusion Centre in Cambridge, to Dr. Maycock, here addressed at the DHSS. And if we pick it up in the 4th paragraph, he says this: there is, of course, going to be an awkward period when more than half the cryo used at present is diverted to producing concentrate. This problem has been discussed previously at one of our meetings. I think it does raise this question once again of to whom you're going to distribute the concentrate. I think this also leads on to the organisation of haemophilic centres, and I think it's just as urgent that the proposed reorganisation of these should be expedited and laid down in a departmental circular. Most of our cryoprecipitate, so from the Cambridge Transfusion Centre, goes to Addenbrooke's or Norfolk and Norwich, but there are still dribs and drabs going on to other places. And then he raises in the next paragraph a suggestion of looking at figures for the current usage of commercial concentrates. If we then move from March 1975 to the middle of 1976, Dr. Darnborough wrote again to Dr. Maycock, CBLA 40383. On the topic of factor 8 production, he says, is there any news yet of how factor 8 concentrate is going to be distributed from Elstree, and if so, how much is likely to be available? We now seem to have reached our June target for donation units processed for fresh plasma for fractionation, i.e. approximately at the rate of 12,000 units per annum. If we include also our present rate of production of cryoprecipitate, we now seem to be working at a total rate of about 20,000 units per annum, which is rather more than the total East Anglian target, which was altogether 18,500 units per annum. He then, in the next paragraph, 3 lines down, says this: however, it would be nice to know when we can start reducing cryoprecipitate. If factor 8 concentrate were available to us now, we could very readily divert the present cryoprecipitate production into further fresh plasma. And then there's a reference to asking Dr. Chalmers, who was the director of the Haemophilia Centre in Cambridge, for his estimates on future usage of cryoprecipitate and concentrate. If we then go to CBLA 40387, CBLA 40387. No? Well, that is the right reference, but it may just be that you haven't got the document. Let me explain what that document is. It's a letter dated the 15th of July 1976 from Dr. Chalmers, so from the director of the Haemophilia Centre in Cambridge to Dr. Maycock, explaining that the demands which had been made by the Centre for Concentrate had been extremely small, mainly due, said Dr. Chalmers, to the excellent service we get in the form of cryoprecipitate from Dr. Darnborough. And it also records that they now have a number of patients on home treatment using cryoprecipitate. So Cambridge, another example of a centre which appeared to be happy to use, at least at some point in the 70s, cryo for home treatment. He asked for a supply of concentrate, but that was to enable patients to take it on holiday with them. There is then a series of communications, which I, for the most part, won't need to go to, between Dr. Darnborough, Dr. Chambers, Dr. Maycock, and others, relating to the proposed reorganisation of the arrangements for the supply of products within the East Anglian region. There was a proposal to bring East Anglia into the broader Thames region, and we looked at some of the documents in relation to that when we were looking at the London centres on Wednesday. I'm not going to go back to those. The only letter I think that we need to turn to in terms of displaying on the screen is at CBLA 40410. This is Dr. Darnborough to Dr. Maycock in August 1976, and you'll see reference in the second paragraph to the issue which I just described, Dr. Darnborough's and Dr. Chalmers' concern about linking East Anglian supplies to what was described as the metropolitan regions, which was in fact London and Greater London. And we can see it sets out Dr. Chalmers describing the current system in East Anglia as a distinct and very satisfactory system. And then if we just see the third paragraph, we can see there that Dr. Darnborough says this: the other suggestion, which I did not like, was that possibly the RTCs could distribute commercial factor VIII as well as NHS factor VIII and cryoprecipitate. I feel it would be quite wrong for the National Blood Transfusion Service to have anything to do with the commercial preparations, and I'm very surprised to learn that one centre is acting as a middleman in this respect. I would certainly refuse to do this. So that would, whether the position changes in subsequent years is not clear, but that would certainly suggest that at this point in time, the Cambridge Regional Transfusion Centre, happy to supply cryoprecipitates, happy to supply NHS concentrates to its haemophilia centres, but not willing to act as a supplier of commercial concentrates. I won't put the document up on screen, but there's another document from December 1976, the reference being CBLA 40510, which suggested as an East Anglian allocation of NHS concentrate, the region would receive 60 bottles per month, of which 44 would be allocated to Addenbrooke's. If we then go to CBLA 40533, we can see these are the minutes of a meeting of Haemophilia Centre and Blood Transfusion Director in December 1976. Again, we looked at some parts of this when looking at the London centres. We just go to the second page. About a third of the way down the page, there's the heading RHA, so that's Regional Health Authority, Area 04, East Anglia. It identifies there's one haemophilia centre at Cambridge, so that's the position in late 1976, and the designation of a haemophilia centre or associate centre has been proposed for the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, and we'll pick up the picture in relation to Norfolk and Norwich shortly. I won't go to the document, but again, just a reference for you and for the transcript. There's a further meeting of this group in September 1977 at CBLA 40657, in which Dr. Chalmers reported that the Regional Transfusion Centre had now purchased some commercial concentrate, 50,000 units of commercial concentrate, to be used or to be held as a store. And Dr. Chalmers reported that in relation to the Haemophilia Centre, at that point in time, they were using cryoprecipitate in hospital and NHS and commercial concentrate for home treatment, with commercial being used to make up for a shortfall in NHS concentrate. So that was the picture as at the autumn of 1977. And that's broadly consistent with the recollection that Dr. Seaman described in her witness statement, albeit she took over as director only in 1984. She couldn't recall the use of cryoprecipitate from that point onwards. In terms of choice, her statement says the centre didn't always have a choice as to what products were available, and then said in relation to patients, patients generally accepted what was offered to them as we could not always give them a choice. Turn to consider the numbers of patients then treated at the Cambridge Centre in the period 76 through to 85. The number of haemophilia A patients treated ranges from 33 to 52 during that period, so a reasonably large centre. The number of haemophilia B patients treated fluctuated quite markedly from year to year, but was up to 25, and then a very much smaller number of von Willebrand's disease patients treated during that period. If we look at a handful of the annual returns starting in 76, HCDO 301064, we can see that in 1976, 52 haemophilia patients treated, 25 haemophilia B, and the product mostly in use was cryoprecipitate by a fairly considerable margin. I think 400 and looks like 72,850 or something along those lines. But in any event, significantly larger than the others. NHS concentrate used in a very small volume indeed, and then a range of commercial concentrates used, factor VIII, co-8 hemophil and cryopulin, the largest of those being Hemophil, 73,000. If we then look at 1977, HCDO 301145, we'll again see that the main product in use was cryoprecipitate. No NHS concentrate used at all. Hemophil, 42,000 units odd, and then a small amount of co-8. If we then go to 1978, HCDO 301240, page 7, we'll see that although cryoprecipitate is still in substantial usage in 1978, its use has now been overtaken by NHS concentrates. So more NHS concentrate used in that year than cryoprecipitate, and a smaller proportion of commercial concentrate, and only one type of concentrate that year, Hemophil, 46,000 units. 1979, HCDO 301309 shows a continuation of that trend. So increased use of NHS concentrate, 224,000 odd, reduced use of cryoprecipitate, although still not insignificant, over 100,000 units. And then the figure for the commercial concentrates in relation to factor VIII is unclear. It may be that that's 182,400, which would be obviously a substantial usage. But it's not clear whether something's been crossed out entirely. And then we see hemophil in any event used, 20,000 units.
Well, if it's going to be more or less the same, just a slight increase from the year before, it would be 24,000, sorry, 2,400.
Yes.
Because the total number of units is in the 300,000s just the year before.
But a significant increase in the number of patients treated that year. So there'd been 36 haemophilia A patients treated in 1978, but 51 in 1979.
Ah, I see, yeah.
Which is what led me to think it might be a larger figure, but it's not possible to say, I think, with any confidence.
It's not clear,
no.
Anyway.
If we then pick things up at HCDO 301404, this is the return for 1980, and we've now got the split into hospital and home treatment in terms of how the figures are reported. So you can see there, I meant to do the maths and get ahead of you, Sir, for once, on cryoprecipitate, but didn't. So we've got the figures in bags there, and then, but only for hospital treatment. So cryoprecipitate not now, it would appear, being used for home treatment. And then we've got the figures in relation to NHS concentrate factor VIII, so the Armour product, and then the Highland product. And we can see fairly large volumes of each being used, as at 1980. And if we go, for example, to page 4, we'll see these forms that we're now very familiar with, and they show, the same pattern is repeated on other pages. There are some patients who receive only one type of commercial concentrate, but there are other patients who receive more than one type of commercial concentrate. So there's no obvious adherence to a policy of keeping patients on one type of concentrate only. 1981 is HCDO 301502. Again, we've only got cryo for hospital treatment. The home treatment figure for factor VIII, again, I'm afraid, is not clear. So we can see a substantial volume of NHS concentrate being used for home treatment, a substantial volume of the Armour product being used in hospital, and a smaller volume of Hemophilia. But precisely what the figure is for home treatment for factor VIII, whether something appears to have been written over or crossed out. So it's not, again, I'm afraid, not clear. Um, 1982, however, shows something of a shift. So that's HCDO 301605. A significant reduction in the use of commercial concentrates. So NHS concentrates are now, for this year, far and away the main therapeutic product in use. You'll see an entry there, sir, in the home treatment column for cryoprecipitate, but I'm not confident that that is in truth an entry for home treatment, as opposed to an attempt to translate the number of bags into a number of units. By reference to the...
It translates exactly as 70 times 515.
So it would appear that only NHS concentrates were being used for home treatment in 1982. 1983 is at HCDO 301701. We can see from it that the amount of the Armour product, the factor VIII product used in hospital has increased, but it's still majority usage of NHS concentrate, and that's the sole product being used for home treatment in 1983. And then, lastly, 1984, HCDO 301797, and this is the first year which shows Dr. Seaman's name on the annual return rather than Dr. Chalmers. We can see again cryoprecipitate usage in hospital only. And by a significant margin, the main product in use is NHS concentrate, although both factor VIII and co-8 are in use. And again, you'll see the reference to Scottish product, which we saw in one of the returns yesterday. Down the bottom of the page, other materials. Please specify Scottish, 22,100 hospital, 22,820 home treatment. How it was that the Cambridge Centre came to be using Scottish product, I'm afraid, is unclear. We don't know. So a fairly mixed picture from the returns. In terms of knowledge of risk of hepatitis HIV, Dr. Chalmers attended a fair number of UK HCDO meetings, including a number of meetings in the 70s at which issues relating to hepatitis were discussed. So he was there, for example, in the 1974 meeting when Dr. Crask reported on the hepatitis outbreak in Bournemouth. He was there in 1979, at least for day one of the UK HCDO meeting, when there was a discussion of the development of hepatitis as one of the outstanding problems in haemophilia today. Although it's right to note he wasn't there on day two, which was when the work of the Hepatitis Working Party was produced. But again, no reason to think he wouldn't have been sent minutes and copies of reports. He was there in 1981 when Dr. Crask presented a report of the Hepatitis Working Party. There are also a handful of documents showing Dr. Chalmers reporting hepatitis or jaundice in patients to, for example, Dr. Maycock. And reports to Oxford through the hepatitis survey. Dr. Chalmers also attended the October 1983 UK HCDO meeting, at which Dr. Chisholm raised the issue of reversion to cryoprecipitate for home therapy. He would no doubt have been the recipient of Dr. Crask's Professor Bloom's, Dr. Ritzer's March and June 1983 letters to Haemophilia Centre directors. And we know that Dr. Chalmers also received, in relation to a patient who was also a pupil at Trelaws, one of the letters from Dr. Wassef, which refers to AIDS-related investigations and looking for the stigmata of AIDS, and that's in June of 1983. Dr. Seaman has, in her statement, set out her understanding or developing understanding of the knowledge of risk from blood and blood products. By way of summary, she says she acquired her knowledge from colleagues and from journals. She says she wasn't very conversant with the risk of hepatitis and blood transfusion, but knew it did occur, and was aware of the risks of using unsuitable donor material. She says her knowledge of HIV and AIDS was gained from experience over time. She thought she probably became aware of the possible association between AIDS and blood products around 1982, but can't be certain. In terms of the process for testing patients for HTLV3 in Cambridge, Dr. Seaman's recollection is that testing was carried out by the Public Health Laboratory Service at Addenbrooke's Hospital. Her recollection is that she saw the patients who were HIV positive in person and discussed the significance of the test result with them. Her recollection was that it was likely that an explanation as to why the test was being done was given at the time the sample was taken. If we look at CBLA 302032, we can see that as at February 1985, she was writing to Dr. Snape at BPL on the issue of supplies of heated factor VIII concentrate. And she explains in the second paragraph as follows: this haemophilia centre serves a rather rural practice, and a large number of our haemophiliac patients live a long way from the hospital. Over the years, we've encouraged the development of home therapy for such patients. I think it's going to be difficult to revert back again to hospital treatment. This will cause a considerable amount of difficulty, especially for the mothers of young children who've not instant transport available. And then she expresses concern about the amount of laboratory testing and handling that would need to be undertaken. That's in relation to the proposed protocol which BPL had drawn up for the use of heat-treated material. So she seems to be expressing some concern as to whether the centre can comply with BPL's proposed protocol. And we can see, bottom of the page, so this is as of February 85, she says, we're already experiencing difficulty in getting tests performed outside our own laboratory on patients who are serologically positive for HTLV3 antibody. There's then a further letter BPLL 0010618. It's a letter dated the 19th of February 1985. Again, it's to Dr. Snape from Dr. Seaman. She sets out details of patients who might fall within the categories of the BPL protocol for receipt of heat-treated product. We don't need to look at that, but if we go over the page, she then, in relation to patients other than those that she'd listed on the first page, says this: all the other patients live, I think, too far away to be sure of obtaining the correct number of samples, and anyhow, the majority are already HTLV3 antibody positive. So that would suggest that in relation to Cambridge, a significant amount of the testing, perhaps, as her statement suggests, being undertaken at Addenbrooke's itself, had been completed by February of 1985. And then if we look at TREL 5039_219, This is a communication late 1986 with Dr. Arenstam at Trelaws. It's about an individual patient. If we look at the bottom two paragraphs on this page, you'll see in the paragraph at the top of the screen the reference to writing to Dr. Krask. So the question or the possibility of seroconversion through use of heat-treated armour product was a live issue in relation to patients treated in Cambridge. But then I just wanted to pick up on this last paragraph. She says, incidentally, I was speaking to the patient's GP the other day and thought it wise to mention the seroconversion. Have you written to him officially concerning this, or do you wish for me to do so? I have been regularly informing the GPs of all patients registered with this centre who are HIV antibody positive. In addition, have you told his mother? So it would appear the practice at the Cambridge Centre was for Dr. Seaman to tell GPs, unclear whether that was with the knowledge and consent of the patients. In relation to this particular patient, it appears she's told the GP that he is HDLV3 antibody positive, in circumstances where she doesn't even know if the boy's mother has been told. Again, so you'll wish to consider, no doubt, the evidence you've received, both written and oral, from patients who were treated at Cambridge or whose family members were treated at Cambridge. You've heard, for example, oral evidence from a widow whose husband, under the care of Dr. Seaman at Addenbrooke's, explained that he was told by letter in January 1985 that he had tested positive for HIV. The figures that we have from UK HCDO in terms of seroconversions in Cambridge indicate 16 patients identified as positive in 1985 and 2 in 1986, giving a total of 18. We don't at the moment have any information in terms of numbers infected with hepatitis C, but we are hoping potentially to receive further evidence in relation to that, possibly from Dr. Baglin. So that's the position in relation to Cambridge. I turn then to the second major East Anglian centre, which was Norfolk and Norwich. And you would have seen a reference there in one of the documents we looked at to the suggestion that Norfolk and Norwich be confirmed as an associate haemophilia centre in the 1970s. Dr. Leslie was director of the Norfolk and Norwich Centre from around late 1976. Prior to that, he'd been at Southampton. And then from 1979, we see on annual returns Dr. Black also being identified as a director of the centre at Norfolk and Norwich. If we pick matters up with the annual returns, we can get a sense of both the size of the centre and the products used. So if we start with 1976, please, HCDO 5020_005. And we go to page 3. We can see at the top there 20 haemophilic patients treated during 1976, 13 haemophilia B patients treated. And then if we look at the products used, no NHS concentrates at all in 1976, cryoprecipitate in use, just under 29,000 units, but that is outweighed by the volume of commercial concentrate in use, and we can see 4 different commercial concentrates used that year: factor 8, co-8, hemophil, and cryobulin, with the largest in terms of volume being the armour product factor 8. We can then pick the matter up in 1977 with HCDO 301190. And we go to page 9. 1977, 13 patients with haemophilia A treated, 9 haemophilia B. We can see cryoprecipitate still in use, but now there are NHS concentrates used, and indeed that is the largest in terms of volume, so 62,000 odd units of NHS concentrate. There are still commercial concentrates in use, but to a lesser extent in that year, very small amounts of CoA and cryobuline, and then a larger amount, 23,330 units of hemophil. So a change as between 1976 and 1977. Insofar as 1978 is concerned, HCDO 301288, page 3, you'll see there a significant reduction in the use of cryoprecipitate from the preceding 2 years, although still in some use, and that NHS concentrates are the main product in use, just under 85,000 units, with only one type of commercial concentrate being used that year, 9,030 units of hemophil. And then sorry, that's 1978. Back looking at it, yes. 1979 is at HCDO 0001358. And this is where we see Dr. Black and Dr. Leslie both being identified as directors. Get very little used in terms of cryoprecipitate. Main product in use, NHS concentrates, but both factor VIII and hemophil also being used to a not insignificant extent. If one then looks at the position in 1980 at HCDO 301456, we've now got the breakdown as between hospital and home treatment. Cryoprecipitate used only to a small extent and in hospital. The main product used, again, for home treatment is NHS concentrate. But there are volumes of factor VIII being used and hemophil again, in fairly large volumes. And they're used both in hospital and for home treatment, although to a greater extent for the purposes of home treatment. 1981, HCDO 301555. HCDO 301555. Shows almost no cryoprecipitate used at all. If we can just zoom in on the figures, thank you. Some of the figures are slightly indistinct, but we can see NHS concentrate used both hospital and home, but particularly for home treatment, so 164,000 or so units for home treatment. And then there are 2 commercial products in use both for hospital and home treatment, factor VIII and hemophil. The volumes there for home treatment seem to be smaller, so it looks like 13,158 units home treatment factor VIII and 2,550 of hemophil. The figure for the use of hemophil in hospital is indistinct, but we can see in any event is small. But then factor VIII in hospital seems to be in fairly substantial usage, so just under 72,000 units of factor VIII used in hospital.
Well, it looks like one bottle.
Oh, for the hemophil, yes. Yes, I'm sorry, I'd gone up to the column, the row above that, so for factor VIII, 144
yes.
units. But yes, so you're right, it does look like one bottle.
And then the number of units in that bottle to the right-hand side of that, which broadly corresponds. It looks like 225, whereas it's 10 bottles is 2550.
Yes.
So it's the same broad level.
Yes, yeah. So haemophil not in considerable use at all, but the factor VIII is, in particular, for hospital treatment. In 1982, HCDO 301655, and happily these figures are typed and easier to read, we can see again that the main product in use for home treatment is NHS concentrate, 175,000 plus units, as opposed to 38,000 odd units of factor VIII. So again, still substantial usage. And then in relation to hospital treatment, it's the armour product factor VIII that is in most use, compared with the NHS concentrate, and no cryoprecipitate at all in that year used for the treatment of haemophilia A, although we see it is used to a small extent for a carrier of haemophilia A and a patient with von Willebrand's. And then 1983, again, similar pattern. It's at HCDO 301751. Similar to the previous year, only NHS concentrate and factor VIII, the armour product, in use. NHS mostly used for home treatment. The armour product used both in hospital and for home, but not to the same extent as the NHS concentrate. Perhaps should just look at 1984 as well, because that does show a significant change. That's HCDO 301845. So 1984 shows almost no commercial concentrate used at all. Vast majority of treatment is with NHS concentrate, both in hospital and at home, and then very small volume of factor VIII and co-8 used. What prompted that change, and whether it was conscious or simply reflected what was available, I'm afraid we don't know. In terms of knowledge of risk of viral infection, again, the best guide, because we have little by way of direct evidence in relation to Dr. Leslie or Dr. Black, is attendance at UK HCDO meetings, and presumably the keeping up to date by reference to medical journals. So Dr. Leslie was a fairly regular attender at meetings in the 1970s, and was also there in 1981 and 82. Dr. Black, sorry, 1981 and 83, Dr. Black attended in 1982. There is one further document that may cast some light on the approach to the use of heat-treated products. BPLL 305848. This is Dr. Black writing to Dr. Lane at BPL in April 1985 about a particular patient due to have knee surgery. A patient with haemophilia B says he had a bilateral knee replacement in February 84 when we gave him approximately 75,000 units of factor IX. We might be less liberal this time in view of AIDS, but this is to give you early warning of a large request from us. So that's the letter from Dr. Black to Dr. Lane. And then if we look at CBLA 302221, this is a letter from Dr. Black to Mr. Pettit at BPL in July of 1985, and we can see the first paragraph refers to about availability of factor IX. It is referring to the same patient, I can tell you, as the earlier letter. And it would appear that the view being taken by Dr. Black as at the middle of 1985 is that surgery should be deferred until heat-treated factor IX material is available. And so potentially a shift in thinking from early 1984, when he talked about being liberal with the use of factor 9, through to the middle of 1985. There is little by way of contemporaneous documentation that casts any light on the way in which patients were tested for HDLV3, or how diagnosis was communicated to them. But there is a chain of correspondence in the 1990s in the context of an application to the Macfarlane Trust, which may cast some light on the matter. If we look at DHSC 0002532_012, we can see this is a letter, July 1995. It's a posthumous application for payment. If we go further down the page, we can see in the last paragraph, there's a question about whether the patient understood what they had been told in terms of diagnosis of HIV, or were treated to what's called a denial state. And if we go over the page, there is then reference to two further letters, both of which we have if we need to look at, which say this: the letter from Dr. Watkins suggests the former to be most likely. In other words, that the patient didn't understand what they'd been told. And the description in Dr. Leslie's letter of HDLV3 partly supports this, since it was never a term widely used. Both Dr. Watkins and Dr. Emerson indicate denial as a possibility. A combination may also be possible in that the use of the unfamiliar term HDLV3 would make it easier for the patient to reject consciously or unconsciously the possibility of being HIV positive. And then this: one way or another, the medical carers did not manage to make sure that the patient was aware of his status. And that is perhaps even clearer when one looks at the letters referred to. I'm not going to put them on screen now, but if I give you the references, they are DHSC 0002532_014, and then the same reference but _015. And the view expressed in the first of those letters from Dr. Watkin was that the patient hadn't understood the original communication to him to mean that he'd been infected with HIV, and then had been shocked to learn 8 years later that was the case. So it does raise a question as to the adequacy of the communication of information about diagnosis and its significance in Norfolk and Norwich. In terms of numbers infected, the information that the inquiry received from UKHCGO identified 13 patients associated with the centre infected with HIV. One identified as such in 1984. That may be a reference to a test carried out in 1984 or to the testing later of a 1984 sample. We can't tell which. 9 in 1985 and 3 in 1986. So that is the position in relation to what the contemporaneous material tells us about Norfolk and Norwich. I can then take the position of the other 3 centres in the region, so Ipswich, Bury St Edmunds and Peterborough, much more quickly, because they're smaller centres that may not have been established until later. The Ipswich Hospital had as directors at various points from the 1980s onwards Dr. Simpson and Dr. Dodd. We have a description, we have a statement from Dr. Simpson. We don't need to put it on screen, but it's WITN 3881001. She was a consultant haematologist at the Ipswich Centre from 1986 to 2000. She says that there were regular but infrequent outpatient sessions, few patients, and if treatment was not straightforward, patients would be referred to Cambridge as being the large regional haemophilia centre. We do have an account from a witness who's given both written and oral evidence to the inquiry, who describes being treated for a bleed in December 1982 at Ipswich. That may have been at a point in time when, although patients were treated there, it was not a designated haemophilia centre. And he recalls, and indeed told you so in his evidence, about how he was then referred to Addenbrooke's. There are no annual returns prior to 1987 for Ipswich, and that may reflect the fact that it didn't have a formal status until a later stage. The position's not clear. I won't go through the detail of the annual returns, but in terms of size of centre, the 87 return shows 18 patients registered with the centre, of whom in that year 3 haemophilia A patients were treated, 2 haemophilia B, and 1 von Willebrand's patient. And then we similarly have returns for 88, 89, which show similar numbers of patients being treated. There are meetings attended by haematologist Dr. Edwards, based at Ipswich, and by Dr. Simpson in the 1980s, of the Haemophilia Working Party of the Association of Haematologists of the North East Thames region. The first that we've identified is December 1984. And there are discussions there about the likelihood of haemophiliacs being HTLV3 positive, and there's a discussion there about the use of commercial concentrates. Dr. Edwards attends another meeting of the same group in November 85, where there's a discussion about informed consent. And we've looked at a number of these documents, I think with oral witnesses in the past, so I'll just give the references. BART 40676 and BART 40674. Dr. Simpson attends similar meetings of the group, but rather later on in 1989 and 1990. She was also an attender of UK HCDO meetings on a fairly regular basis, but again, that's from the late 1980s on to the 1990s. The only other insight that we have into the way in which treatment was delivered at an earlier stage at Ipswich is through the evidence of the inquiry witness from whom you've heard oral evidence, Alan Burgess, and the reference there is WITN 1122001. I won't repeat his evidence, but it sets out the process, amongst other things, of being informed of diagnosis by letter from Ipswich Hospital. Bury St Edmunds, again, appears potentially to have been established only as a formal centre later on in the 1980s. So the earliest annual return we have for Bury St Edmunds, which was based at the West Suffolk Hospital, is from 1989, which shows 7 patients registered, but only 1 patient being treated. The director of what was in due course recognised as a haemophilia centre at Bury St Edmunds was Dr. Jones, and there are also communications from Dr. Booth, the paediatrician, which show that patients with bleeding disorders were being treated at the hospital, albeit not necessarily under the auspices of a formal recognised centre until a later stage. There are documents that show, again, unsurprisingly, a relationship between the hospital and the Cambridge Centre as the main haemophilia centre for the East Anglian region. And then there's correspondence which shows communications, for example, from Dr. Boothby to BPL, looking at reactions to treatment with Elstree factor 8. There is also a letter which suggests that diagnostic tests for HTLV3 for any patients associated with the hospital were undertaken by the laboratory at Addenbrooke's Hospital. So again, consistent with what Dr. Seaman's recollection was about the testing arrangements in the East Anglian region. But that, I'm afraid, is the extent of the information we have in relation to Bury St Edmunds. And then lastly, in terms of this region, we have Peterborough. Again, there's little by way of information or documentation. We see identified as directors at various points Dr. Fareham and Dr. Wimperis. But the earliest return we have is 1987. Again, that may reflect that that's the point in time at which Peter began to operate as a distinct centre, returning data to UKHCDO. So I won't take you to the 1987 return, but in terms of the numbers of patients treated, it shows 5 haemophilia A patients treated and 2 patients with von Willebrand's. And again, similar numbers over the years that follow. We do have at DHSC 010026_035 a letter from Dr. Darnborough, again the director of the Regional Transfusion Centre in Cambridge, to Dr. Maycock. This is October 72, and it shows usage of cryoprecipitate. We've got the figures there for a number of hospitals in the region, so we can see Addenbrooke's the greatest user in terms of volume, 1,115. And then Norfolk and Norwich next in terms of size. And then we can see Peterborough, the next still, so 172 there identified. What precisely that's referring to, we don't know. But it tends to suggest that, as with, we've seen with a number of other, in particular more rural areas from time to time, there may not have been designated haemophilia centres until later on, but patients were nonetheless treated for their bleeding disorder at often local hospitals, which only subsequently became recognised at a much later stage as haemophilia centres. And we can, if we go to IPSN 40146, we can see there, this is 1977 in sales of CoA8, so the factor 8 concentrate produced by cutters. If we go down the page, we can see sales to Peterborough. It's about 6 entries up from the bottom. 2,900 units of CoA8 sold in the period November 76 to October 77. So some treatment with commercial factor 8 concentrates being undertaken. I won't take you to it, but there's then an updated figure which shows a continuing sale of CoA8 to Peterborough. There's little else by way of contemporaneous documentation. HCDO 40255_068. It is a letter from February 1979 from the Deputy Director of the Cambridge Transfusion Centre to Dr. Lane at BPL, and you'll see in the first paragraph there reference to a patient at Peterborough District Hospital becoming hepatitis B surface antigen positive after receiving cryoprecipitate and NHS factor 8 concentrate, and also receiving some commercial factor 8 concentrate. So we can see again, although we don't have any annual returns, some treatment of patients with bleeding disorders being undertaken at Peterborough in the 70s, and some usage of both cryoprecipitate, NHS concentrate and commercial concentrate. Dr. Fareham attended some UKHCDO meetings, but that's really very much later on. So he attended, for example, a meeting in 1990 and 1993. So that's the position in relation to Peterborough. And I'm going to depart to East Anglia and move to Bangor. Wonder whether we take the break 5 minutes early.
Yes, let's do that before we move to Wales. So we'll take a break until 20 to 12. 20 to 12.